1940s, it was a very scary time to be gay. Being out of the closet was risky. You could be thrown in jail or lose custody of your kids. You could also be targeted with cruel treatments, like forced hormone injections to try to lower your sexual desire, or shock therapy to deter homosexual thoughts. That's because the medical community at the time considered homosexuality to be a mental disorder, even though there wasn't any data to back this up. But in 1945, one woman decided to scientifically study this commonly held belief, and her research helped spark the modern gay rights movement.
What they were saying was homosexuality is a pervasive emotional disorder. I suppose I didn't have any problem about that because the world of factual discovery is constantly being remade, changed. So what it's called this year, evil and whatever, next year may constitute the blessing of the human race.
This is Dr. Evelyn Hooker. She taught psychology at UCLA in the 1940s. While teaching there, Evelyn met a student named Sam Fromm who would stay after class and chat with her about the course. Over time, they became friends, and their friendship continued after the semester ended. Eventually, Sam felt safe enough to tell Evelyn that he was gay.
Being gay at that time was not something you just disclosed to everyone without concern.
This is Dr. Gregory Herrick, a professor emeritus of psychology at UC Davis.
So Evelyn was in this unusual situation. She was a heterosexual woman, a psychologist, and she was being introduced to this rather large circle of mostly gay men.
Evelyn even went on trips with Sam and his friends up to San Francisco, where they took her and her husband to visit gay bars and drag clubs.
Unbelievable. I've never seen anything like that in my life. I just thought it was the craziest place. Imagine. There was this lively circle of friends. And in that group, there were philosophers, poets, engineers, you name it, they had it.
One day, Sam asked Evelyn if she could study him and his friends to show scientifically that being gay wasn't a mental illness. He argued that it was her scientific duty to study people like us. At the time, the only published studies of homosexuality had been done with prison populations, or those being given psychiatric treatment. She could see from her own experience that Sam and his friends didn't fit with what she had learned in her psychology textbooks. But Evelyn knew she couldn't study her own friends and remain objective. She needed to recruit a random set of subjects, which proved to be a tricky task. For her study, she set out to compare the mental stability of 30 gay men and 30 straight men. Now remember, this was during the McCarthy era, when homosexuals were often labeled as communist or traitors to America.
Every man who came to me put his occupation, his job, his reputation at stake.
Luckily, Sam was able to put her in touch with a wide group of gay men. The hard part was actually finding straight men who met the criteria for the study, so she had to get more creative.
Basically took anyone she could find, and she joked that her husband said that no man was safe on their street because if they were showing up to repair the plumbing or to mow the lawn or something, she was going to grab them and get them in her study.
She eventually found her subjects. Each group took several psychological tests. One you may know is the Rorschach ink blot test, where a subject is shown an ink block image and asked to describe what they see. Once everyone had taken the test, their overall psychological adjustment was evaluated using a 5-point scale, 1 being superior and 5 being maladjusted, and the results were clear.
Almost the same number of gay men and straight men are found in number 1 and in number 3 and in number 5, which means there's no difference in the pathology between the gay man and the straight man.
She had top psychologists look at the Rorschach data, and they couldn't tell whether a subject was gay or straight any better than if they had flipped a coin.
Mort was absolutely convinced that he could tell, and in fact, when he couldn't, he asked as a special favor if he couldn't come back and go through the process again because he was so sure that he would be able to do it.
This was a huge deal. Her study clearly and objectively disproved a basic myth about homosexuality. So Evelyn was, in many ways, extraordinary. Here was this psychologist, a woman, studying sexuality in the 1940s. She published several papers from this study, the first in 1957, but nothing immediately changed for the gay community.
So it was wasn't really the case that in this storybook way, the data came out, they were good, and everyone said, oh, we've been wrong, and they changed the policy. Instead, it took some agitation. It took some activism.
Evelyn's study gave gay and lesbian activists the ammunition they needed to show that homosexuality was not an illness that needed a cure. So they started showing up at American Psychiatric Association meetings and would picket outside. Some psychiatrists at those meetings were sympathetic, and they would bring in activists to take part in the conversations about homosexuality. In 1973, roughly 15 years after Evelyn's study, the American Psychiatric Association finally took homosexuality off the list of mental disorders.
So it's really important to have the data, but often make the data visible, make people know what's out there, and communicate the results in a way that sometimes scientists are not so good at.
Because homosexuality was on the list of mental disorders, it was often used to justify laws that discriminated against the gay community, from employment and housing discrimination to bans against same-sex marriage. In the last years of her life, Evelyn worked with the next generation of researchers, including Greg, to support and fund more research on sexuality, and to use science to shine a light on the lives of LGBT people. And over several decades, this research, along with a growing cultural visibility, was presented to the courts, including the Supreme Court, in key cases that overturned many of these laws. We like to think about science as being rational and objective, but scientists don't conduct their research in a cultural vacuum. The psychiatrists in the 1940s who labeled homosexuality as a mental disorder weren't basing this on data or research. They had blind spots and prejudices that compromised the science. Evelyn's groundbreaking research helped to challenge this bias, but she never would have begun studying the topic if it hadn't been her friendship with Sam. Because he opened her eyes to the gay community, she was able to challenge scientific convention and prejudice about being gay.